Good afternoon. Warm welcome to you all. My name is Hanko Jurgens from the Duitsland Instituut. And I wish you also welcome on behalf of the Manasseh Ben Israel Institute and the Huizinga Institute. All very Dutch names. I'm very glad you're all here for the spoken theater of Der Pavian Trauerspiel in einem Act from 1824. It's the Goethe Zeit, of course. In 1819, Goethe's Faust was performed only partly, and the first real performance of Faust I, so to speak, was 1829. One could also say it's the Biedermeier Zeit, but I think that scholars don't use these terms anymore because they're, well, the concept is a little bit blurred, so to speak. Okay, Germany was still recovering of the Napoleonic Wars in this period. The Congress of Vienna took only place in 1815. And Prussia was defeated in 1806 in the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt, which caused a lot of problems, of course, for Prussia, but also initiated the Prussian reforms of Freiherr von Stein, and also of Wilhelm von Humboldt, which we all know as well, and introduced also the Edict of Emancipation for the Jews in 1812, who got citizen rights. Perhaps we will hear today, this afternoon, something about it, because it was, of course, not a full paradise immediately. And so we will hear this theater act this afternoon in German. And I hope you all have a booklet so you can read it as well. If you don't have it, perhaps there is on the back. There are no copies anymore. So perhaps you can share copies if you don't have one with somebody else. I'm very glad that Ezra is here. Ezra Engelsberg, the auctor intellectualis of this afternoon. He is a PhD candidate at the UvA, the University of Amsterdam, and working on identities in Jewish German theater between 1800 and 1871. He did a research master in history and a master in Middle Eastern studies at the UvA, and he is focusing on knowledge-theoretic epistemological problems in historical representation and on 19th century literary historiography in the German language. And we are even more happy that Deborah Hertz came all the way from San Diego. I think you arrived on Friday and you will leave tomorrow morning, so we're really honored you're here. She is the, and I hope I pronounce it well, the Herman Wouk, yes, chair in modern Jewish studies at the University of California at San Diego. She is specialized in modern German history, modern Jewish history, modern European women's history, and is currently working on the history of radical Jewish women. And she wrote several books, which I would like to recommend. For example, How Jews Became Germans, the History of Conversation and Assimilation in Berlin. Published at Yale University Press in 2007 and also published in German. And, for example, as well, Jewish High Society in Old Regime Berlin, published in 1988 at Yale University Press. The title of her talk, so we will first have an introduction of Ezra, then we will have the play, then Deborah Hertz will speak to us, and the title of her talk is Secret Secrets and Open Secrets in the Life of the Playwright of Ludwig Robert, 1778-1832. And I also want to recommend you another meeting, so then I'm ready and I've said everything, which is tomorrow, also organized by the Duitsland Institute and the Goethe Institute, on present-day Jewish life in Berlin, communities, culture, and the city, where we have distinguished guests such as Mirna Funk, a Berlin writer, Dani Krantz, social anthropologist, and Hetty Berg, the director of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Ezra, the floor is yours.
Hi, welcome, and also welcome to everyone who is digitally here. We cannot see you, but you can hopefully see us. A very, very brief introduction, because there's lots going on already this afternoon, and you gather here mostly to hear these people and Deborah later on. So a small aside as to why we are here. This afternoon was created in the atmosphere of my research, which is indeed about identities and German Jewish, that is to say, Jewish or German language texts, theater texts in the 19th century written by authors of Jewish descent, as is the case of Ludwig Robert, whom we're going to read a play of, and also of Michael Beer, who is actually the more famous but absent author here, because what we have is a parody. And this parody that we are going to read was originally performed not on stage in public, but was a private setting, and was something that circulated only in manuscript form in the private sphere of Ludwig Robert. So we are talking about his family, his friends, and the only manuscript source that exists of this play explicitly mentions that it was not meant to be performed publicly. So what we are doing here, in a way, may be violating what Robert's intentions were, but everyone involved has passed away long ago. Now, what is important for you to know before we commence is, because there is lots of intertextual play, of course, in this parody, and Robert might have assumed, or must have assumed, that all those who read his play knew the original play, which is called Der Paria, which was pretty much a box office hit when it came out in 1823 in the Berlin Hoftheater, which is a play à clef, more or less, staging an Indian pariah in the role, actually, of contemporary Jews in the German states, a complaint to the way they were being treated by society, but then translated into this Indian garb. What we have with Ludwig Robert is that he changes. Am I audible? I am to myself. It doesn't say anything. So we have here, what you probably have already noticed, is the translation or the transformation of paria into pavian, which is baboon. And throughout, this is actually maintained as the main joke of the story, because the story of, say, the original play is changed only very, very minimally. The biggest changes, I would say, are the fact that the paria is now not a paria, but a baboon. So he's even lowlier. And the comic character of Hansworst is introduced. Hansworst in Dutch. Stock character originally from the Commedia dell'arte, whom we always see in comical asides, but whose presence here, actually in a Trauerspiel, is quite remarkable. So throughout witnessing what is going to happen here, I would like to ask you to ask yourself, what does it mean that the paria is no longer a paria, but a baboon? And then, because this is my only time behind this this stool here, this thing, I would like to thank a number of people, so bear with me. Of course, I'd like to begin with thanking the people who are going to perform for us, two of whom also on the couch there helped me organize this afternoon. Also, I would like to thank Xavier, who is behind there and is going to assist us in several ways and has already. And most of all, of course, I would also like to thank Deborah Hertz for being here and shedding light on this afternoon. So, enjoy. And firstly, I will introduce the characters that we are going to see right now. We have Eer, that is to say the paviaan. We have Zie, his wife. We have Paviaantje, their kid. We have the antagonist, der Fremde. And we have the provost. Who has a small role indeed. And then we have also the shipsvolk together.
Ei, ei. Und der Hanswurst. Das bin ich.
Century once again. Wald in den Tropenländern. Ein Felshöhle, ein Feuer am Boden, dabei ein Lager von welken Blättern im Hintergrund der waldbewachsenen Eingang der Höhle. Donner und Blitz. Windesbrausen und sonstiger Lärm.
Mein Kind, o himmlisches Geschütz, Blitz mit dem Schlangenauge, Leugebrüll, 10.000-fältiges des Donnerwetters, verschont mein Kind, mein Kind, mein Kind, mein Kind.
So kämpfen Drachen und Harpienbrut und Riesenschlang und Elefant, wie jetzt Natur, die man die güt'ge Mutter nennt, an Elementen herzt, was gütige Natur, den Schmeicheltitel, die du mir Stiefgesinnte nicht verdienst, den gab ein Priester dir, ein Heuchelpriester, der von des Tempels Reichtum üppig schweigt und keine Ahnung hat von all den Qualen, die ein verachtetes Geschöpf erduldet, ein armes Tier, das er im Leibe hat, ein Pavian, wie ich, in dessen Seele der edle Stolz sich mit Gemütlichkeit und mit der Tugend Kunstsinn sich vermählt. Doch nein, verzeih, Natur, ich lästerte. Du gabst mir Hand und Fuß und Herz und Kopf und, was man sonst bedarf, du bist gerecht. Nur Menschen sind, nur Priesterbrut ist schlecht.
Mein teurer Gatt ist von der Jagd zurück. Den Göttern Dank, die dich in diesem Wetter...
Was ist Wetter? Bange nicht, mein Weib. Hier unter diesem heiligen Affenbaum sind wir von Klutem Nestras Tochter sicher. Ich meine vor Elektras blitzendem Geschoss, das nicht durch diese Zweige dringt. Ach, wären wir vor Priestern auch so sicher.
Wie meinst du das?
Dass ich ein Pavian bin. Fühlst du die 100.000-fältige Schmach, die in diesen einzigen kleinen Worten liegt? Was sind die Menschen, die mich stolz verachten, die mich vom Hof, vom Heer, vom Ritterstuhl, ja selbst aus ihrer Teegesellschaft bannen? Was sind sie mehr als ich? Sind sie nicht Affen? Und bin ich nicht ein Tier wie sie? Hab ich nicht Augen, Nase, Mund und Ohren? 2 Arme, nicht um tüchtig dreinzuschlagen, 2 Silberfüße, um davon zu laufen, und doch versagt man mir das Ehrenrecht, mit Kokosnuss und Sonnenwurfgeschutz, das Vaterland von Feindeswut zu schützen und Ordensband und Stern mir zu erwerben. Warum? Weil Affeneltern mich erzeugt? Nein, wie nach ewigen Naturgesetzen der Menschenkinder oftmals Affen sind. So ist nicht jedes Affensohn ein Affe. Und selbst ein Pavian kann gebildet sein und kann von Vaterland und Schlachten träumen. Seht her, die Feinde nahe, ich führe euch an, mir nach, dorthin, wo die Kartaunen brüllend aus ihren Feuerschlünden Eisenwürfel voll tausendfacher Todesaugen speien. Mir nach und haut die falschen Spieler nieder, so recht, sie fliehen, sing, sing, ich bin verwundet, der kalte Schneemann-Tod reißt mich zu Boden.
Mein süßer Gatt erhitzt sich ohne Ursache und macht auch mich vor einem Nichts erschrecken.
Das freut mich, süßes Herz, dass du erschrickst. Der Schrecken ist ein Hebel der Tragödie.
Die Last von deiner Feder zu bewegen, brauchst du den Hebel etwas früh, mein Gatt. Doch apropos von Schrecken, teurer Freund, so will auch ich dir einen Schreck erzählen.
Mach's nur recht lang, dass sich an mein Gramm zerstreuen.
Dort, unter jener Palme grünem Dache, die einer Jungfrau gleich mit schlankem Wuchse das Haupt verschüchtert neigt und anmutsvoll, inwährend ihr zu Füßen 1000 Blüten den Hain hinauf die Blicke sehnend wenden, aus dem Smaragd des Mooses sich erhebend, das einem Teppich gleich. Du schläfst, mein Gatt?
Nicht schlafen, Unglückseligen, nur weiter.
Dort, auf den bunten Blüten, schlief die Frucht, die zarte Frucht von unserer Leib und Treue, dein Ebenbild, mein kleines Paviänchen. Und mütterlich bewacht ich es als Mutter, bis die Natur mein Dasein überraschte und mir das gähnend stumme Wesen sandte. Du kennst es doch, man nennt es Langeweile. Die rang mit mir und überwand und warf mich in ihres Bruders in des Schlafes Arme. Doch als der Sandmann wich von meiner Wimper und nun der Sonne goldene Strahlenfische sich in den Netze meiner Augen fingen, weh mir, da war mein Kind, mein Paviänchen. Wo ist der Mann, der einer Mutter Angst in ganzer Fülle fühlt? Du schläfst, mein Gatt.
Nie schlafen, Unglückselige, nur weiter.
Da war mein Kind, mein Paviänchen fort. Dem Huhne gleich, das Enten ausgebrütet, am Teiche jammert, wo die Küchlein schwimmen. So stand ich erst betäubt, dann schrie ich furchtbar, gleich wie das Schakal fleckige Genossin, laut heult, wenn man die Jungen ihr entwendet. Und endlich, wie die flüchtige Gazelle, eilt ich dem Pfande deiner Liebe nach, dem Blinden ungefähr mein Los vertrauend, das günstig mir in diesem Stücke war und ist. O zürne nicht, mein teurer Gatt, als ich in meiner Angst den Urgranit trotz deinem ernsten Machtgebot erklommen, den Urgranit, von dessen Zackenhaupt das Meer sich diesem wüsten Eiland zeigt. Da wallte geisterhaft, hoch in den Lüften, um Hilfe rufend in die See hinaus, ein schneeweiß Mannsgewand mit langen Ärmele, geheftet war's an einen kahlen Lorbeer, der dort verwaist auf ödem Fels erstarb. Und unter diesem Bäume stand ein Mann, mein süßes Paviänchen auf den Armen. Ich lauf hinzu in Mutterangst und Wonne, doch als der Mann die Fülle meiner Reize, die mir zu karg verschleierten, gewahrt, setzt er mein Kind rasch auf den Boden nieder und mit der Riesenkraft ungeistiger Begierde umschlingen glühend mich 2 nervge Arme und mit den weichen Formen eines Weibes ringt nun die Muskelstärke des Athleten. Ich bitte, flehe, weine, meine Tränen sind Öl in seine schwarzen Herzensflamme. Jetzt schwindet mir die letzte Kraft, ich sinke.
Oh, nicht weiter. Weh, ich kann sehen das Los, das einem Pavian bereitet ist, der aus dem Menschenstamm sein Weib erkor.
Sei diesmal unbesorgt, mein Gatt. Zwar sank ich, allein der güt'gen Götter einer sandte mir einen Genius in meine Not. Dein Ebenbildchen, unser Paviänchen, der kluge und höchst edelmüt'gen Knabe. als ob er wüsste, welch Geschick dir drohte, war er auf dem Boden leis herbeigekrochen. Und jetzt, bei höchster, schrecklichster Gefahr, treibt ihn sein angeborener Instinkt, dass er mit seines Mäulchens weißen Waffen der Tugendräuber in die Wade beißt. Er schreit, schaut um, es rinnt sein Blut. Und ich, der Augenblick ersehnend, spring empor, das Tugendenglein hüpft auf meinen Rücken und nun, gleich einer Gemse, stürz ich mich von Fels auf Fels hinab. Flieh dann waldeinwärts, von Angst getrieben schnell und immer schneller. Und so mit wundem Fuß zum Tod ermattet, erreiche ich endlich unsere Höhle. Und mein Kind und meine Unschuld sind gerettet.
Ist das Istürchen lange her?
3 Monde.
3 Monde, sonderbar. Und du verschwiegst es?
Ich wollte deine Ruhe nicht gefährden.
Und heute? Weshalb erzählst du es heute mir?
Weshalb? Aus öffentlich geheimer Ursache. Du hörst es ja, man löset die Kanonen. Vermuten kannst du, dass das Mannsgewand dort auf dem Felshaupt seine Pflicht getan. Mit seiner ärmelweißen Schwanenflügeln hat es ein fernes Schiff herbeigewinkt, dass es an dieser fernen Insel lande, um den verschlagenen Seemann zu erretten. Ich höre Menschentritte, flieh, mein Gatt, denn wenn das Schiffsvolk dich all hier gewahrt, so opfern sie dein Kind als Bastardbrut. Und dich, den Pavian, schnüren sie in Ketten und stellen dich, o Schmach, o bittere Schande, fürs Geld in einem Käfig aus zur Schau. Drum fort von hier in unsere Kinderstube, in jene Nebenhöhle, fort, mein Gatt, und lass allein die Fremden mich empfangen.
Ich wage viel.
Wer wagt, gewinnt, nur fort, mein tapferer, mutseliger Gemahl, nur fort.
Welch qualmend scharfer Übelruch, der hier die Luft verpestend mir entgegendampft.
Hier wohnt ein Pavian. Pfui Teufel, pfui. Ein Pavian, ein Pavian, ei Pest.
Das nennt man Vorurteil, Stolz auf Geburt. Die eitle Esel fliehen den armen Affen. Sagt, lieber Herr, wollt ihr denn auch von hinnen?
Ich wollt's gern, doch mein Wadenwunde brennt mir der Biss vor einer Höllenschlange.
Habt ihr denn immer noch so Scheu vor Wasser?
Jawohl.
Und auch vor Wein?
Das nicht.
Nun denn, so war die Bestie, die euch bist, nicht toll und eure Wasserscheu ist nicht gefährlich. Ich auch, der ich doch nicht gebissen bin, ich leide auch an solcher Wasserscheu.
Ich halte mich nicht länger. Lass mich dort auf jenes Bett von welken Blättern nieder.
Nur links gehalten, lieber Herr, da rechts, ihr seht es selbst, darum kann ich es verschweigen. Aber sagt mir mal, verschlagener Herr, warum habt ihr euch denn nicht lieber von dem Schiffsgregorius verbinden lassen? Was habt ihr denn nötig, in diese Pavianshöhle zu kriechen?
Hans Wurst, bedenke doch das alte Sprichwort. Es heißt, in unseres Lebens Trauerspiel vermag der Natur wohl 10-mal mehr zu fragen, als ihm antworten können Held und Dichter. Und dieses negative Urgesetz ist Schicksalssamen und ist Schicksalsblüte. Weißt du es nun, weshalb ich mich hier zeige?
Ihr fragt?
Ja, Hans Wurst.
Nun, so seid ihr danach und ich werde mich wohl hüten zu antworten. Ich bin ein Held, ein Dichter.
Er ist's, er selbst.
Sie scheint's zu sein, Sie selbst.
Seid uns willkommen hier in unserer Höhle. Wir wollen gastfrei eure Wunden heilen.
Ja, meine Herzenswunde sollst du heilen. Und gleich, du reizbegabtes Hüldgeschöpf.
Er ringt mich hier. Sie entflieht.
Ermattet sink ich hin und sie entflieht. Heiß brennt der Biss in meiner wunden Wade, so wie der Pfeil in meinem wunden Herzen.
So geht's, wenn man ein Jahr lang auf einer Wüsteninsel gelebt hat. Da findet man selbst eine verschleierte Affin reizend.
Hans Wurst, du lästerst, sie ist himmlisch schön.
Herr, ihr Himmel, sie ist lästerlich hässlich.
O Menschenbrut, verführt von deinem Priester, verweigerst du uns armen Pavians, nein, uns deinen Nächsten, deinen Mitgeschöpften. Jedweder Recht und häufest, Schmach und Schande, so furchtbar lastend auf mein schuldlos Haupt, dass mir das Heldenherz tief niederfällt und dass ich kriechend nun in eigener Höhle gleich einem Hund mich diesem wütrig nahe. Fast glaub ich selbst, dass ich nicht nur verachtet, nein, auch verächtlich bin. Was ist zu tun? Nichts bleibt mir übrig, ach, als Edelmut. Und den will ich auch gleich so sattsam üben, dass Menschen sich vor Affen schämen sollen. Sich höchstgeborene, gnädigen Mensch erlaubet das dich.
Ein Pavian! Ein Pavian!
Verfluchter Pavian, gib es dir. Fort, fort, hilf dich. Oder diese Hand beim Himmel renkt deines Nackens Wirbelbein dir aus.
Wie könnt ihr euren Nächsten so misshandeln?
Fort, Sportgeburt der Menschenähnlichkeit, du Witz des Satans, Brahma zu verhöhnen.
Ihr werft hier diesen Dolch nach meinem Herzen. Ich heb ihn auf, er ist in meinen Händen. Bewaffnet bin ich jetzt und ihr seid krank und seid allein, unfähig euch zu wehren. Mit leichter Mühe könnt ich euch erstechen. Doch fürchtet nicht, die Menschen nur sind grausam, wir Affen nicht. Denn so wie Eisen wird, erweicht von Glut, so macht uns Schmach gemütlich. Nicht eure Hand, nur euren Fuß begehrig. Oh, zaudert nicht. Ich will euch eure Wunde mit D und W und Edelmut verbinden. Oh, reicht mir eure Fuß, der Fuß, damit ich Kohlen sammeln auf eure Haupt.
Es lähmt die Krankheit, meine stolze Schweigen. Weh, einem Vieh muss ich mich anvertrauen. Da, Dr. Affe, ist mein Wunderfuß.
Was sehe ich, Mensch? Ihr habt den kalten Brand.
Den kalten Brand?
Und oben ein den Krebs. Rückwärts dem kalten Schmerzen Grabe zu, bewege sich die Pulse eures Lebens. Der größte Arzt und Makrobiotikus, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus, der Paracelsus selbst und auch Bombastus sagt, für den Tod kein Kraut gewachsen ist. Allein er irrt, mein Weib hat eine Salbe, die sie für euch aus einer einzigen Pflanze und einem einzigen Metall bereitet. Schwulstblumenkraut, so heißt die Pflanze. Knallsilber nennt man das Metall. Die Salbe heilt den Krebs, den Star, den Wolf. Ja, hätt euch selbst der Geier schon geholt. Die Salbe macht euch augenblicksgesund. Die Gattin ruf ich her, da kommt sie schon. Gleich Hygieia mit der Salbenbuchse. Sei doch so edelmütig, liebes Weib, und lege diesem fremden Menschen dar, der mich vor kurzem hier ermorden wollte, dein Balsampflaster auf, damit er lerne, was Freund Sarastro sagt, in dieser Pavianshöhle, wie edle Affe schlechte Menschen lieben. Kennt man, oh nein, kennt man die Rache nicht? Du bist schon bei der Arbeit, liebes Weib, so recht, zieh ihm die Heldenstiefel aus, etc. Ich will indes, damit es ja der Handlung nicht an Worte fehle, in einem Monolog mein Unglück malen. Weh mir, dass ich vom Affengeschlechten, weh mir, dass ich ein Pavian bin. Alle natürliche Menschenrechte raubt mir der Menschen naturloser Sinn. Ewiglich haben sie uns zum Besten, belasten mit Schmach uns und Schande und Hohn. Sie laden nie uns zu ihren Festen, ob unsere Mienen, ob unsere Gästen. Ja, unser Name ist Schimpfwort schon. Trauriges Schicksal, traurig und düster, fast stärker als mein Lammsgeduld. Ja, und die Priester sind einzig an diesem Unheil schuld. Sie sind es, die zum Hass aufhetzen, behauptend, dass Brahmas Fluch uns traf. Sie wählen den Tiger zu ihrem Götzen, sie täten besser, sie wählten das Schaf.
Pavian?
Wer schimpft da?
Sind ihr Gnaden denn kein Affe?
Weh, leider kann ich nichts verleugnen. Wer bist du? Du kommst wohl her, mich in meiner armseligen Großmut auszuspotten?
Nicht im geringsten, du edles Tier, der du mir mit dem dramatischen Geschlecht der abrüschen Hunde verwandt scheinst.
Sie sind nahe Vettern von mir. Und wer bist du?
Ich bin ein Glied in der Kette der Wesen, die nach den neuesten Entdeckungen der Naturphilosophie den Übergang von Affen zum Menschen bildet. Man nennt mich Hans Wurst und ich war sonst ein Schauspieler, aber heute schon lange das Theater verlassen und bekleide jetzt andere Ämter. Willst du mich wohl eine Frage erlauben?
Ja, sehr gern. Deine freundliche Herablassung nährt mich.
So sag mir doch, wie war es dir möglich, als Affe diese hohe Bildung zu erlangen? Nicht allein, dass du in den schönsten Versen sprichst, welches mich schon wundert, obgleich dieses Kunststück in letzter Zeit schon allerlei Getier erlernt hat. So fühlst du auch so innig der Unglück, ein Vieh zu sein. Sprichst über Liebe, Glaube und Hoffnung, über Kirche und Staat und Gott und die Welt mit so allgemeiner Einsicht, dass man ganz irre an dir wird und dich für einen jungen Berliner halten sollte. Sag mir also aufrichtig, bist du wirklich ein Pavian?
Wie kannst du, welterfahrener Mann, glauben, dass ich ein Affe sei, ein Pavian? Komm hier beiseite, ich will dich überzeugen. Siehst du wohl? Ich bin ein Mensch. Ich bin der Schauspieler Wolf. Wie könnte ich wohl sonst so schön sprechen und die Gemüter so tief rühren? Aber das bleibt unter uns. Wir dürfen die Illusion nicht stören, denn heute ist alles danach berechnet, dass ein Affe die Menschen durch Edelmut beschämt.
Ja, so? Nun verstehe ich, das ist eine vortreffliche Erfindung, um Diktionsgelegenheit zu haben.
Ich bin geheilt. Die Wunde meiner Wade hat ihre Purpurlippen rasch geschlossen. Es schweigt der Schmerz.
Das tat derselbe Tugend.
Nein, die Tugend tat der Salberin. Magnetisch hat mich ihre Schwanenhand gelind manipulierend mich geheilt. Und wie nach ziemlich langer Hungerkur, so fühle ich meine Pulse, meine Venen, von einem neuen reinen Blut gesättigt. Nur Durst noch quält mich, hätte ich doch zu trinken.
Ihr fühlt des Durstes Flammenqualen? Leider hab ich kein Cup, kein Portwein, kein Champagner. Wie sie der Wirt dem reichen Gaste reicht, weh mir, jetzt fühlchen erst die Pein der Armut. Für mich hab ich genug, für euch zu wenig, denn kleinlich bleibt des Bettlers Edelmut und nichts hab ich euch anzubieten, ach, als diesen Eimer Wasser.
Wasser? Wasser, meinst du? Du Affe, du Pavian, ich sei ein Vieh wie du und süffe Wasser? Wie, meine edle Menschenlippe sollte den Rand des eklen Eimer hier berühren, den du entweiht mit deiner garsten Schnauze? Mein Ross, mein Hund, sie würden sich beflecken, wenn sie mit dir aus einer Schale trinken.
Die bösen Priester sind es, die aus euch sprechen.
Schweig, Pavian.
Ich schweige und leide.
Zu dein und meinem Glück in diesem Stücke habe ich ein Requisit in meiner Tasche. Hier, diese Frucht, die saftige Frucht, seht her, ich führe sie langsam, langsam zum Munde.
Um Himmels Willen, halt, die Frucht ist giftig. Nur her damit. Dorthin muss ich sie werfen.
Kann man wohl edler sein als meine Gattin?
Sie ist ein lieber Narr.
So sei denn du, holdselige Pavianin, die saftige Frucht für meine Flammendurst. Lass dich umfangen, unbekannt Geschöpf. Nicht sträube dich zur reizbegabstes Wesen, denn den Schleier fort, lass mich dein Antlitz schauen.
Es ist vielleicht eine indiskrete Bemerkung, mein teurer und höchst ungewöhnlicher Pavian, aber ich bewundere deine ehemännliche Geduld, die mir fast weibisch vorkommt.
Den festen Fieber meiner Seele hat Verachtung abgespannt und aufgelöst, denn wisse mein Freund, nach der Psychologie oder Seelenlehre wird auch die Seele durch Mangel an Übung, Schlaf und leer.
Concedo, aber ich hätte nie geglaubt, dass eures Pavians leere Seele so mit der Seelenlehre umzuspringen wüsste.
Tja, so bist auch du, Hans Wurst, nicht frei vom Vorurteil und der Standeserblichkeit.
Herab den Schleier. Himmel, was erblick ich? Sie ist es, die schon einmal mir entwischte. Die schaumentstandene Göttin ist nicht schöner, ihr Leute. Kommt herein und schleppt sie fort zu Schiff. Ein Pavian hat kein Eigentum und Allmanns Gut ist eine Pavianin.
Leid's nicht, Freund Pavian, leid es nicht, pack an.
Wie du verstehst, das wäre viel zu früh. Erst muss das Laster noch recht gräulich blitzen, dann schlägt mein Tugend donnerwirksam drein.
Wagt nicht, Unmenschen, mir zu nahe zu kommen. Mein Zahn, mein Nagel wird zur Todeswaffe.
Ergreife sie.
Weh mir, weh, zurück, mein Gatt. Ich halte dich, ja, wie das Eisenband den Leib des Weingefäßes fest umrankt. Wie sich der Anker in den Meergrund hakt, so ranken meine Arme sich um dich mit Eisenkraft und starken Windehacken.
Was soll das sein, mal da gewesene Winseln? Dies Angeklammer, trennt sie, reißt sie fort.
Hilf, Brahma, hilf! Gib einem Weibe Manneskraft, zwickt nur und kneift und reißt. Ich halte fest und meine Schmerzestränen schlucke ich nieder.
Die arme Schluckerin rührt mich in meiner tiefsten Hanswurstseele.
Wie lange wird's? So pack doch tüchtig an.
Weh, Brahma, meine Kraft entschwand. 10 Männer sind stärker als ein einzig schwaches Weib. Man schleppt mich fort. Mein Gatt, zur Hilfe, Hilfe!
Jetzt ist es Zeit, jetzt muss ich es entdecken. Du, der du frech der Gattin mich beraubest, weil deine Priester dich betörend sagen, ein Pavian sei geboren ohne Rechte. Und ihr, o rasende Matrose, die mit rohen Fäusten mir mein Weib entreißt, wie Donner wird euch das Geheimnis treffen, das nur die Not mich zu enthüllen zwingt. Lasst ab von meinem Weib, berührt sie nicht. Das Blut, dem sie entsprost, gebeugt euch Ehrfurcht. Wähnt nicht, dass sie vom Paviansgeschlecht, oh nein, sie sinkt nieder in den Staub. Sie ist, ja staunt mir, sie ist ein Mensch.
Ein Mensch?
Ein Mensch und deine Gattin?
Ja, und Mutter meines Kindes.
Desto schlimmer. Fluchwürdiger Affe, frecher Pavian. Weißt du, welch ein Schreckenstrafe auf dein bestialisches Verbrechen steht? Matrosen auf, eilt fort zum Meeresstrande. Dort, wo in sicherer felsumgebener Bucht mit eingezogener Segeln unser Schiff die Anker warf, auf perlmuschelndem Grund. Um mich Verschlagenen allhier zu retten. Dort eilet hin. Ihr klimmet das Verdeck, steigt nieder in den Raum und ruft den Mann mir her, der mit geübter Hand die Strafen übt, die das Gesetz bestimmt. Versteht ihr mich, den Schiffsprovos, den Lahmen, der, wie ihr wisst, nicht gehen kann? Traget her, dass er den Pavian hier samt seinen Weiben und ihr in Sünd erzeugten Bastardbrut so lange stäupe, bis der Tod erfolgt. Zwar das Gesetz bestimmt den Flammentod, für sie, allein sie, sind das Holz nicht wert. Fort und kehrt bald zurück.
Wir eilen schon. Da der Weg nach dem Strande ein wenig weit ist und wir in der Zwischenzeit, bis der Provus hergetragen kommt, gar nichts zu tun haben, so dächt ich, ihr Unglücklichen, tätet wohl daran, wenn ihr uns, um den Vergnügen eine stete Abwechslung zu geben, eure Geschichte erzählten.
Bravo, Hanswurst, ein guter Einfall. Erzählt beide, denn kurzweilig lang wird's, wenn ihr 2 erzählen.
Ich ging, ein junges Weib von 18 Jahren.
Sie war vermählt mit einem alten Mann.
Mit meinem alten Mann, den ich nicht liebte.
Er war ihr aufgedrungen von den Eltern.
Mit diesem hart mir aufgedrungenen Gatten
ging sie als 18-jährigen Weib zur See.
Ich sah die weißen Fitke unseres Meerschiffs.
Sie sah von Lindenwesten sie gebläht.
Das Meer war ruhig und das Wetter günstig.
So, dass sie durchaus nicht seekrank fühlte.
So war ich 30 Tage lang gefahren.
Als an dem 71. Morgen.
Du irrst, es war am 31.
Als an dem 31. der Himmel.
Der ferne Himmel weiß ein Wölkchen zeigte.
Da sagte ihr der Schiffer, es gibt Sturm.
Ich aber lachte, denn die Sonne schien.
Sie lachte, doch der Schiffer hatte recht.
Ach, leider ja, denn dunkler, immer dunkler.
Ja, immer dunkler ward's am Horizont.
Und endlich kam auf schwarzem Rabenflügel
beschreibe nicht den Sturm, es wird zu lang.
Ja, du hast recht, denn viel ist noch.
Oh, ganz erschrecklich viel noch zu erzählen.
So nimmt dann eure Fantasie zur Hilfe.
Ja, denkt euch einen schrecklichen Orkan.
Mit Flammengeißeln peitscht der Blitz die Wogen.
Du fängst schon wieder an mit Bilderkram.
Zum Himmel flog, zum Abgrund unser Schiff. Und wie die Lava bricht aus neuem Krater.
So strömte Wasser in ihr Schiff und es versank. Sie litten Schiffbruch, damit punktum.
Als ich erwachte, lag ich hier am Strande, von einer Mitleidswoge hergespült. Nacht war es um mich her. Und neben mir, o schreckensvoller Anblick, schwebte drohend und bleich und kalt der Schatten meines Gatten. Du weißt, sprach er mit hohler Geisterstimme, was das Gesetz dem Weibe anbefiehlt. Sie soll dem Manne folgen in den Tod. Drum sag ich dir, dass ich gestorben bin, auf dass du dir den Scheiterhaufen bauest. Versaum es nicht, denn was du auch beginnest, kein Unglücksvogel kommt auf grünen Zweig. Die Feder deines Schicksals ist geschnitten. Die Faust des Mordes hat sie schon gepackt und tötet dich. Dein Winseln ist vergebens. In deines Lebens ersten, einzigen Akt.
Am nächsten Morgen fand ich meine Gattin, die damals meine Gattin noch nicht war. Ich saß auf einem Baum und knackte Nüsse. Da sah ich sie, wie sie mit Schwanenhänden der Rose duhnvolle Zweige brach und dem Gebote des Gespensten folgend sich selbst den grausen Scheiterhaufen baute, indem sie nebenan zu gleicher Zeit mit jenen Schaufeln die Natur uns gab, ihr eigenes Grab in tiefer Demut grub. Ich saß auf einem Baum nach Art der Affen, und eines war sie sehen und mich vergaffen.
Am anderen Morgen, als ich wiederkehrte, den Holzstoß mir zu bauen, mein Grab zu graben, da waren Grab und Holzstoß oder Zartheit mit duftig buntem Blütenschmuck umkränzt. Ich sah umher, da rauschte es in den Zweigen, und hebend meinen Blick empor, gewahr ich, wie halb in Wehmutstränen und halb lächelnd aus dichtem Laub ein Paviansantlitz schaut. Die Ungewohnheit und das Vorurteil, sie machten mich erbeben, fliehen wollte ich.
Allein, ich sprang ihr nach, erwisse sie, und bot mit ritterlicher Zierlichkeit der Dame Schutz, der Witwe Trost und Hilfe, nämlich durch Zeichen nur, denn ich sprache, hat mich die Holde später erst gelehrt. Doch sie verstand, was ich ihr offenbarte und wusste bald, dass mir ein edles Herz auch unter dem gebahrten Tierfell schlug.
So ward ich nun sein Weib.
Und ich ihr Mann.
So lebten wir in Eintracht.
Und ich in Frieden.
Er brachte Äpfel heim und Kokosnüsse.
Und Lerchen auch und manche jungen Hasen.
Wir waren glücklich.
Ja, wir und unser Kind.
Bis auf die Schwermut, dass du Pavian bist. Und deine Wut auf Menschen und auf Priester.
Fluchwürdige Menschen, ja. Fluchwürdige Priester.
Ruhig, Affe, oder ich nehme den Stock.
Ich schweige schon.
Da tust du wohl daran, denn so eine walschlappige, feige Kreatur hat gar nicht das Recht, so zu schimpfen. Ich wende mich zu dir, meine Schwester.
Deine Schwester?
Ja, ich habe soeben entdeckt, dass du meine Schwester bist. Auf welche Weise das zugeht, kann dir gleich sein. Genug, du bist meine Schwester. Du musst meine Schwester sein.
Oh, so errette mich, errette meinen Gatten.
Dich retten, Miserable. Dich und deinen Affen, wofür hältst du mich? Kennt man mich noch immer nicht? Ich bin sehr grausam, voller Vorurteil.
So rette wenigstens mein schuldloses Kind.
Kind? Affe meinst du? Pavian? Nein, bei Brahma, die Bastardbrut muss sterben.
Gnädiger Herr,
Was willst du, Hanswurst?
wenn ihr gar zu bestialisch seid, so lauft ihr Gefahr, dass euch das hochwohlgebildete Publikum auch für einen Pavian hält oder für ein noch böseres Vieh. Legt also eure grausamen Charakter etwas beiseite und rettet die unschuldige Missgeburt. Hey, da kommt sie schon. Papavian, Mamavian, ihr weint, gute Eltern? Kann ich mich denn nicht für euch aufopfern?
ach mein Kind, mein Kind, mein Kind, oh welch ein Kind, so tugendhaft warst in den Windeln schon.
Und dieses Kind voll Edelmut-Genie, weh mir, ein Pavian, ein eingeborenes Vieh.
Fremder Mann, hast du denn kein Eltern, dass du meinen Eltern was tun willst? Friss mich auf, guter Mann, ja friss mich, nur verschone Mama und Papa Pavian.
Die kleine Bestie hat mich zwar gebissen, allein die Unschuld siegt. Ja, ja, Hanswurst, ich rette dieses Tierchen.
Jetzt ist es Zeit. Noch ist er in dem Welt. Er und mein Kind und du und ich, wir alle. Wir müssen hier als Warnungsbeispiel sterben. Fluchwürdger Bruder, schändliches Gesetz. Ich will mich furchtbar, furchtbar an euch rächen. Mit diesem Brand entzünde ich ohne Schonung hier diesen Wald und unsere Felsenwohnung.
Halt ein, mein Weib, die Rachensucht ist nicht edel und zweitens soll kein Einzelner, nicht Mensch, nicht Tier sich gegen die Gesetze lehnen, weil sonst der alte Bau der Staaten wankt.
Und drittens kann man keine Felsenhöhle anzünden. So wenig als ein grüner Wald augenblicks aufbrennt. Er müsste denn auf Leinwand gemalt sein und die Natur über die Kulissen vergessen haben.
Hans Wurst hat recht, aus diesen 3 Gründen, weil Rachsucht nicht besonders edel ist, weil das Gesetz geachtet werden muss und weil ein Fels und grünes Holz nicht brennen. Und 4. wegen baldigen Morgenrote lösch ich dies Licht der Nacht vorsorglich aus.
Das Nachtlicht du und ich mein Tageslicht.
Verstehe ich recht? Auch du willst sterben?
Meinst du, ich hätte diese Giftgefrucht hier ohne alle Ursache hingeworfen?
Du wusstest wohl vorher?
Nun, freilich.
Großherziges Weib, kannst du mich nicht allein wie deinen ersten Gatten sterben lassen?
Oh nein, denn der war alt und du bist jung.
So gib, wie Eva einst im Paradiese.
Ja, ja, du sollst den Apfels Hälfte haben.
Doch unser Kind?
Ach, ja, das vergaß ich ganz.
Wie retten wir dem Tod die Kinderliebe?
Paviänchen ist nicht zimperlich erzogen. Natur wird Mutter meines Tierchens sein.
Nun, denn so lass die Frucht uns redlich teilen.
Da, nimm.
Gesegnetes Mahlzeit.
Wohl bekomm's.
Der Affe gar possierlich ist, zumal, wenn er vom Apfel frisst.
Gerettet ist dein Kind.
Mein Paviänchen? Wo brachtest du es hin? Doch nicht zu Menschen? Nur nicht zu Menschen. Menschen sind unmenschlich. Zum Geier lieber oder gar zum Teufel.
Beruhige dein Mutterherz, oh Schwester. Gesichert ist dein Kind. Auf meiner Achsel trug ich's. Ich wusste nicht wohin. Der Wald ward immer dichter und ich, deswegs unkundig, rief jetzt angstvoll: Wie rette ich dich, du schuldlos armer Neffe? Da bog von einem fruchtbeladenen Kokos ein schwanker Zweig gleich einem Arm sich nieder. Und den ergriff mit der Geschicklichkeit des Tänzers, der auf schmalem Seil sich wiegt, dein kluges Kind, und rief: Onkel, lebe wohl! Schwang mich empor bis in des Baumes Krone und rasch von Ast zu Ast behende springend, war mir im Nu dein Söhnchen aus den Augen.
Ach, hab Dank, Natur. Instinkt hat ihn gerettet.
Was ich an Edelmut vermochte, tat ich. Du aber und dein Gatte müssen sterben.
Das wissen wir.
Denn das Gesetz muss walten, bald nahet der Provos.
Er kommt zu spät.
Du meinst zu früh.
Er kommt bestimmt zu spät.
Wieso?
Weil wir sodann verschieden sind.
Verschieden sind wir jetzt schon, liebe Schwester. Du bist so sanft und ich das Gegenteil.
Verstehst du mich denn nie kurzsichtiger? Schau her, ich habe Gift.
Und ich dergleichen.
Wo habt ihr denn das Gift? Gebt es hier raus.
Wir haben es genommen.
Wie, gestohlen?
Oh, wie gemein denkst du von uns, o Bruder. Doch horch. Musik, Musik. Ja, Janitscharen, das ist das Zeichen, dass wir sterben müssen. Oh komm, mein Pavian, mein süßer Gatt. Wir wollen beide liebend nebeneinander und auf gewohnten Blättertorus legen und über unser Schicksal Klagen führen, damit wir just so sterben, wie wir lebten.
Fang an, mein Weib, und rede zur Musik.
Wenn unser Geist im letzten Augenblicke sich aus des Lebens engen Banden reißt und auf der schaudervollen Todesbrücke ein Engelsbild mit holdem Liebesblicke das dunkle Tor der Ewigkeit umschleust und wir zurücksehen auf das Weltgeschicke, wie das so selten Gold ist, welches gleist.
Concedo, aber die Agonie dauert mir zu lang. Die ist kapabel und plaudert so noch 2 Stunden fort. Ich ziehe ihr das Kissen unter dem Kopf fort. Das ist eine wahre Wohltat, für die Arme sowohl für auch das Publikum. Hans Wurst ist auch edelmütig. So, meine Liebe, nun ist es geschehen. Wünsche wohl zur Ruhe.
Fluchwürdiges Gastelvorurteil der Stände, erdacht von euch, abscheulichen Braminen, ihr tötet mich, ich verschwende viel Großmutsworte und viel Großmutsminen und meinen Feind, dem Schändlichen zu dienen, wie es dem edelmutigsten der Affen.
Ich will auch diesem Schwätzer Ruhe schaffen. So, nun ist geschehen. Sprich jenseits weiter, unglückseliger Pavian. Wir haben hier andere Dinge zu tun. Seid ihr da, Feuerwerker? Hört mal, ihr bengalischen Bengel, ihr müsst hier diese Felsenhöhle in die Luft sprengen, damit von diesem verdammten Paviansnest auch keine Spur übrig bleibe. Und nehmt euch in Acht, dass unser Komödienhaus nicht wieder abbrennt. Auf die Seite, gnädiger Herr, dass euch kein Pulver in die Augen spritzt und keine fallende Soffitte beschädigt. Jetzt, Achtung, Feuer! Puff. So, da geht die ganze Pastete in die Luft. Was für ein Schauspiel, hä? Und wie schon der roten, langen Morgenrot jetzt scheint, es kann auch Abendrot sein. Musik! Leute, geschwind, tragt den Provost, den lahmen Kerl hierher. Oh, da kommt er schon. Der wird sich wundern, wenn er um die Sporteln kommt.
Ist der arme Sünder bereit?
4 für 1, mich rechne ich nicht mit. Wie gefällt dir das Stück, Provost?
Das nennt man Leute für Narren halten. Was soll ich denn hier?
Oh, Vorurteil.
Sag mir noch, was eine Pause ist. Pause, ja.
We now have a short break. And for how much time?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. So enjoy yourself.
I can start. Okay. I first of all want to thank Ezra so much, because when I got an email into my inbox with Ludwig Robert in the subject line, I thought I was in heaven that anybody had ever heard of this interesting man. And then when he said, well, maybe you know someone who lives in Europe who'd like to give the talk, what he didn't know was that I live in a household of grandchildren and husband and all sorts of tasks, and I felt like Cinderella sweeping the hearth, and now I'm at the ball. So I'm very grateful to be here. Ludwig Robert, well, let me get you his picture right away, has certainly been poorly treated by posterity. He's only known to scholars of German theater in the early 19th century. He was incredibly productive. He wrote 25 plays, 5 collections of short stories, translations, adaptations, and was an active editor and journalist. He had very notable friends, although he was known to be cantankerous and unstable. This way? Okay. Most of the people in my family think I'm a very good screamer without a mic, so... He had an intermarriage. I forgot to put his beautiful wife up here, and so was accepted as a Jewish convert, marrying a Christian woman. So he was described as erratic, bitter, and alienated. He really wasn't poor, but after 1806, in the Napoleonic Wars, his family lost a lot of their fortune. Now Ezra will correct this. None of his plays achieved a huge popular or critical success. We'll leave that maybe to the dissertation till we find out. His older sister, who was his super confidant, is the famous one. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her, but she's becoming sort of a cult figure slowly. But there's time. Posterity is long. And Hannah Arendt made her famous with Hannah Arendt's famous biography of her. And here's one of the many pictures of her as an adult. Now, as you can see from the picture of them as children, they grew up in a very well-to-do home. They had amazing opportunities, but the higher they climbed, the more they were targeted by the romantic nationalist intellectuals hostile to Jews. The fact that these critics were usually friends or acquaintances led to extreme psychic distress. He remains very close with his older sister, but she actually, Ezra and I, this is a big topic, achieves more fame and notoriety not through publishing and not through journalism, but through her salon. She suffers a lot, but she had quite a fame that must have been a topic of intense conversations. The very topic of name changes is amazing. So Ludwig Robert is actually born Liebman Levin. Then the family in 1814 takes on a name, Robert Tornau. You can think of the Mendelssohns who took on the name Bartholdi. This was kind of, you might say, new names by purchase, or kind of almost ancestry by purchase. So I'm going to talk a lot in this short time allotted to me about the actual duel that gave rise, we think, to Robert's play, Der Macht der Verhältnisse, which we can talk about the translation. Ezra translates it, as he told me this morning, the power of social bonds, I think he might use, or the power of caste, the power of relationships. We'll leave that to Ezra. So I want at the very end of the talk to talk about self-hatred and whether that's the best way to describe someone like Ludwig Robert. So as a teenager, he was allowed by the city and his parents to go to the Französisches Gymnasium, which was the elite high school in Berlin. I can see his sister being intensely jealous of this this privilege that he had. And then he gets into a very interesting period where his family wants him to train to be a businessman. So they send him to Breslau to work with the family business, and then to Hamburg. This is a pattern which is actually repeated again and again in the German Jewish context. Heine went through a very similar situation. They're trained, they're expected to be financiers, but they don't want to be, they want to be gentlemen. And in order to become a gebildete gentleman, what do you have to do? So these are the things that Ludwig Robert does when he's in his 20s, in the late 1790s. He learns to dance. He plays the cello. He's considered a witty conversationalist. And of all the things that he would hate, I will read you a quote from the Wissenschaft des Judentums. This was a Maskilic, progressive modernist club that he does not join. And these are the things that the Maskilim, the modernists, hate: huckstering, senseless customs, tyrannical rabbis, bad schools, superficial cleverness, uncouth manners, discrimination against females, and apostasy. Well, those are all things, except for apostasy, that Ludwig Robert would have considered himself to be the enemy of. Now, this man is amazingly peripatetic. Here's what looks supposed to be a salon, even though it looks kind of lonely and masculine to me, but we don't have very many images. So he's roving around. He goes to Paris, then he says, oh, I can't keep up my social style here, so I need to go to Vienna. And then he comes to Amsterdam. Some of it, I think, is that he's freeloading with various relatives who are putting him up when he can't afford the way he wants to live. He does become, this is Rahel Varnhagen van Enze. This is the husband of Rahel. So this is the brother-in-law of Ludwig. And he has pretty scathing things to say about Ludwig. You know, one of the interesting issues for historians is, you know, what right do we have to know their private opinions? And a lot of them who did not want us to know their private opinions just threw their correspondences into the fire. And I often think about whether I have the right, you know, to know all the nasty things that they were actually saying about each other. And one of them is Varnhagen's attitude towards Robert. That's not the picture I want. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, I wanted to just briefly talk about how much money he has. So we don't know exactly, but Rahel Levin, before she gets married in 1814, has $900 a year. $600 a year would be what a professor's family would live on. $150 a year would be what a worker would live on. So when you have 900, we have to presume that Ludwig Roberts must have been around that amount. These are not poor. But if you're aspiring to dress like a nobleman and have noblemen invite you to their parties, you need a lot more money than that. So they feel poor, but they're really not poor. Okay. Okay, let's talk just for one moment about his conversion. We don't really know as historians what's going on in the minds and hearts of the converts. When Ludwig Robert, after he converts, he has a golden cross that he keeps with him at all times. I don't know whether it's survived. One thing about the Robert family is that they were not all against conversion. When his sister Rahel converts, it's in the home of her brother, who's also converted. So the two brothers, other than Ludwig, who are in business, also convert. Ludwig converts. The sister who comes to Amsterdam and marries Karl Asser seems to be the only one who does not. Anyway, I think I may have gotten a little astray with my slides, so let me just go back a minute. Okay. So this is the edict of 1812, and it's because of this that they changed their names, because the edict says that all names have to be regularized. So instead of a Jew with the word Levi moving between first name and last name, it would be the formal last name. So this was the opportunity for a Liebman to become a Ludwig. Rahel stayed Rachel, but we see amazing transformations. The two brothers, one was Mordechai and one was Meyer. Then suddenly one is Moritz and one is Marcus. There's a wonderful book in German called The Stigma of the Name that I could talk about later, but I won't get lost in this. This is something that I'm sure Ezra will talk about in the dissertation, because this is called Unser Verkehr, which would be the translation something like Our Society. And this was a satire that was at a much lower level than what Ludwig Roberts and Michael Beer's presentations were in theaters. This was like a traveling satirical group. And if you read the story of the satire, it's all about arranged marriage and money. All of the Jewish characters, they're always, I'll show a few more of them, they're always dressed in what would be very lovely clothing for the upper class, even the nobility, especially these sort of yellow pants, but they don't have the body for it. So it's a satire of the relationship between their pretensions and what's seen to be their reality. And one of the ways that the, you would say the anti-Semitic message of the play is distributed is through placards of the characters, which I found in an archive. Let's skip this. Napoleon, we don't need him right now. We don't need Prussia right now. Okay, this is where I wanted to be a few minutes ago. This is the count where Ludwig gets a job in 1813. And it only lasts for 1 year. Why does it only last for 1 year? Because he can't go to court. You can be the private secretary of the count, you can take care of the correspondence, you could maybe, I don't know, serve the coffee, or maybe somewhere between a butler and a governess and somewhere in there, but you can't go to court. And if you can't appear at court, you can't really hold that job. So that shows in a way how ambitious he was and how successful he was in this world, but the glass ceiling is extremely low. Okay, now is where I want to be. Okay. So let's talk about what happens in 1811. In 1811, we're at the salon of Sarah Levy. And Sarah Levy is an Itzig daughter. These were the most accomplished women of Berlin, from the very wealthiest, the most exempt from rules and taxes. It's a very interesting story. And she comes to have a musical salon. She's also herself a performer, and she's a patron of Friedemann Bach. And one evening, she invites Bettina von Arnheim. There, on the left. Bettina von Arnheim, who was friendly with Rahel and was very different than her husband, Achim von Arnheim, who was a nobleman who really detested Jews. And so the invitation goes to Bettina. What does Bettina do? She brings her husband. When her husband appears at the salon, he's wearing muddy boots. No, this would be sort of a tuxedo event. And then he starts making snide remarks about his hosts to other guests. And I don't have a picture of him, but the nephew of Sarah Levy, Moritz Itzig, is 24, a student at the University of Berlin, an admirer of Fichte, and a Jewish patriot and a Prussian patriot all at the same time. I don't have a picture, but we'll look for a minute at the person that we think told him about what happened. Okay, so I'm getting a little convoluted. Okay, Salon, badly behaved nobleman, nice wife. Okay. Young nephew of Sarah Levy, who overhears these nasty comments, challenges Achim von Arnheim to a duel. Well, a duel is not allowed. Jews are not allowed to duel because it's only honorable people who can duel, and the Jews are outside that circle. So when, of course, Achim von Arnheim says, I'm not dueling with you, I'll talk about you any way I want to, Moritz Itzig beats him up, goes to the baths where he's taking a hot sauna of some sort and sort of attacks him. Okay, Achim von Arnheim threatens to have him arrested and, in fact, mounts a lawsuit against the nephew who complained about him from what he did at the salon. At that point, the court lets him off. In other words, the court sort of sides with Moritz Itzig, and Achim von Arnheim is very distressed. Meanwhile, the papers all about the court case are revealed and given to this man, Julius Edward Hitzig, who's the son of converts, and we think he would have been the source for Ludwig Robert to take this whole case and make it into the play. Okay, and I just want to talk a little bit here about Ludwig Robert and his letters to his sister Rahel about this issue of duels, because it's absolutely fascinating how obsessed he was with the duel. He says, he writes this in 1815, "It is impossible for one, after he has been forbidden as a Jew for 35 years, suddenly to have courage." He's talking about why he didn't serve in the War of National Liberation against the French. Then he says, "I have another kind of courage. I wouldn't let myself be insulted without fighting a duel." So you see there his commitment to the idea that the duel is, in fact, a good way to resolve these conflicts. So now I will skip over a discussion of his play that is so fascinating, that is maybe not as, well, we'll see. We'll compare it to the play that we just heard. Here is a E.T.A. Hoffmann sketch of Hitzig, a little bit less flattering. Little tone of mocking there. It's usually around the issue of body image here. Okay, this is a rendition of the Deutsche Tischgesellschaft. I don't think it's a very good one, but it's the only one that Google knows about. It was a noble club that Achim von Arnheim started, and it was a patriotic club. He thought of it as a burgeoning proto-institution of a German parliament. So keep in mind, these people are very progressive in some regards. They could be anti-monarchy. They could be for German unification, kind of pre-1848ers in a way, but yet they don't like Jews. And they especially are eager to keep converts out. And what does that tell us? The glass ceiling is lowering even deeper, so that even if you go through all the hoops, as Ludwig Robert did, and convert, you're still not really accepted. So now I want to turn. Here we have two Jews dueling. This, of course, is much later, you can see from the hats. But the whole history of Jews and the duels is a really fascinating topic. Okay, now I want to hover here for a minute. This is a color lithograph from 1819. So that was the year of one of Germany's only pogroms in the 19th century. We have some around 1848, but it's nothing like Russia. They're having pogroms constantly. Germany, it's much more rare. And I want to concentrate on this couple over here, because this, in my mind, is Ludwig von Arnheim. And this, Ludwig, I just crossed them, sorry. And that's without wine, right? That's Achim von Arnheim. And this would be the Ludwig Robert character. So these people shouldn't surprise us, right? These are artisans, lower class people who hate Jews. That's a very, very old story. This is a very, very new story and a very, very modern story. And the fact that the lithographer would put this in the picture is totally shocking, completely shocking, because he wouldn't put it in there if it wasn't something that he could at least imagine. Okay, now I want to talk about 4 other converts to put Ludwig Robert in context. So this is the woman, Amalia Behr, that Heine called the luckiest mother in the world because she has 4 Wunderkinder. This was the dream of the Jewish family in the 19th century, wealth and talent. Together, we can take on the world. What's fascinating about her is she is considered not exactly a traditionally religious woman, but a modern religious woman, and she's the founder with her husband of the very, very early Reform temple, which met in their house for 8 years. But look how she's dressed. It's kind of a shocking picture for a woman who's really the loyal Jew in this whole story. Here's her son, Giacomo Meyerbeer. What is he wearing? Yellow pants, right? And he changes his name. He's originally named something like Meyer-Beer. These names are constantly switching, but they Italianize him to make him seem less Jewish, a kind of act of conformity, certainly not passing. He moves to Paris. He's a very famous conductor. His compositions are often transposed complaints about prejudice. So his famous opera, The Huguenots, is transposing, you could say, the same thing that Ludwig Robert is transposing in the wonderful play that we just saw. Now, this is Michael Behr. So we'll go into this, I hope, a little bit more. He is one of the talented sons of the Amalia Behr, and he doesn't convert. He writes the play The Pariah, that this is a satire of, and he dies in a very, very sad way. He's asked to march in a royal procession, and then he's sort of bumped from his position that he wanted to be with a woman, and he has a hysterical fit after he's been disinvited, and he dies. So this kind of immediate solving a problem that you cannot solve by death is not just in literature, but also in life. Okay, this is one of my favorites because this is Felix Mendelssohn, who is converted as a 9-year-old, and then his parents, he's the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, so he has a very, in Yiddish we would say a wonderful yichus, right, a wonderful lineage, and his parents convert him, not because you need to be converted to be a pianist, you don't, but they wanted him to be a law professor, so they got him ready for that. But what's amazing about this, it's kind of a small moment writ small of German-Jewish relationships, because Goethe is not looking at Felix, right? He's looking at eternity, and Felix is looking at Goethe. Well, you could say this kind of sums up in many ways the Jewish-German high culture relationship in this time period. Okay, there's 2 more that I want to talk about that you may not have heard of before I conclude. I hope, am I still in my time frame here? I hope. So this is Gans. And what I love about this painting is the fingers. The way he's poised there, it's showing such kind of exquisite self-regard. So Gans is also someone whose family is in financial troubles. He comes from a well-to-do family. They want him to become a lawyer so that they can get out of their money troubles by having their son sue everyone. Well, Gans doesn't want to do anything like this. He wants to be a professor, standing up here like I am at the University of Berlin. And he's a test case for the edict. Is the Edict of Emancipation going to allow him to become a Jewish professor or not? And the answer is, after 5 years of waiting and waiting, the answer is no. And this is what Gans says, or he writes, what has survived to us. If the state is so stupid as to demand that I profess something that the responsible minister knows very well that I do not believe, well then, it shall have its way. Heine, his very good friend, who worked together with him in the Wissenschaft des Judentums, writes a poem against Gans's conversion in 1822 or 23, where he calls him a scoundrel. You know, he's jumped off the boat of Jewish reform and he's choosing ambition and self-regard instead of loyalty to his people, you know, and then what does Heine do 2 years later? Also converts. So these are men who have a very narrow space for themselves. They fight very hard to become intellectuals, but once they do, they can't tolerate someone else. And let me just have my last slide here, who's named Moritz Gottlieb Saphir, and maybe next year you'll do one of his plays, because he's also a forgotten genius of the time period. And here he is wearing his curly blonde wig. He was a hysterically funny man. I hope he'll come back into print, because he wants to mock everything. Whereas the Heines and the Gans, they want to be in the big world. They want to be the big personalities. They don't want to be the kind of Jewish intellectual of the Nazi satirization of these are people who are always critical. They're not creative. That was a big tension, you could say, in German Jewish history for a very long time. Okay, now I want to conclude with asking the question about self-hatred. Because when I started writing about converts many years ago, I was haunted by this. And I'd wake up every morning and I'd say to my husband, well, were they really self-hating, or were they taking advantage of opportunities that were really so special and so modern? And I'm still worrying about that. So let me show you how historians of Jewish social history have divided up the world that we're studying here. So on the one hand here is acculturation. These are things you can do that nobody can stop you from doing if you have the money and you have the will. These are things over here that you need someone else to play along with you. You need someone else to invite you. So one way to look at someone like Ludwig Robert is he's doing all these things. He's getting all this in order, and it's not easy. It's very difficult, actually, and it can be very lonely. But then he's stumbling when it comes to these things. And so when you do all of that to get that, and it doesn't quite work that way, or it works for a few years and then it's canceled, where is your identity? Where can you go back to find a secure identity? So this is thanks to my brother. My brother told me about 10 years ago, he said, Deborah, there's a book you need to read. It's about gay identity. I said, oh, I'll put it on my list. He said, no, because he knows very well when I say put it on my list means the 10th of never. But he said, no, you need to read it right now. So it's my brother. I did exactly what he told me to do. And it's a book that was written by the law professor, Kenzie Yoshina. He's a Japanese law professor, of Japanese descent. And he developed this model for understanding gay identity. And I won't take too much time. I'll just briefly go through, first of all, the two ends of it. On this end would be authentic Jewish identity and performance. So for this, you can take like a religious Jew in Jerusalem or something. They feel totally Jewish on the inside. They look totally Jewish on the outside. And that's what they do. And that's authentic. Over here, you have someone, we meet a lot of them in the Nazi period. These would be like, of someone who didn't really know they had any Jewish background. Who fits this is Leopoldstadt, Tom Stoppard, before he's enlightened about his Jewish background. So there's nothing left. There's nothing Jewish left. It's either because it's several generations, or it could be because they changed their name, they change everything, and they think, or they do feel Christian on the inside and project as Christian on the outside. Okay, now it's these two in the middle that I think are extremely interesting for understanding anti-Semitism. So let me talk this one about, this is the notion of the open secret. The open secret is that you know you're Jewish, and everyone else knows that you're Jewish, but let me say this again. You know that you're Jewish, but you actually do pass, and no one knows it. So you're succeeding in your performance, but on the inside, you still maintain your identity, as opposed to these people over here. Now, this is where I want to put Ludwig Robert and his sister, and that is covering. Covering is you stay Jewish on the inside, but you do something to make yourself appear less Jewish, not because you actually believe it, but because it is an act, a gesture that you think will help your assimilation. So from American contemporary life, I know this is going to, I'm going to get into trouble here of some kind, but I'll say it anyway. It would be like, I think of it as Michelle Obama's hair. She doesn't have an afro. She's not Angela Davis. She's very proudly black, but she doesn't have curly hair. And I also thought of the nose job or a lot of relatives in my family who in the 40s would have changed their names. And it wasn't that anybody thought that they weren't Jewish. It's just, they just made it a little bit easier. Okay, so now let me conclude. In the end, what do I mean by open secrets and secret secrets for the difficult lives of all of these people? For Ludwig Robert, it was an open secret that he was Jewish. He knew that the theater public knew the truth. When he chose to write about Jewish themes to protest against the oppression of his people, he dared not address the issue directly, even if he was a convert. Did he lack courage, or did his public lack authentic sympathy? By transposing and channeling the Jewish issue into a class fight against aristocratic dueling, who was fooled? But then, you know, I wrote this before I watched the wonderful performance. When I watched the performance, I could see the beauty of a blank metaphor that you could read in as a vegetarian statement, anti-Nazi, anti-colonial, especially with the poetry. So I think I may have undervalued the channeling. What were his secret secrets? Perhaps a regret that he had to pay such a high price for success, and a self-pity that his fame and fortune might not have been worth the high price of deserting his people in their time of need. This leaves us with the difficult problem of whether or not true artistic success must be based on painful experiences, painful truth, and the willingness to remain obscure but authentic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You hear me? Yeah. We will have a short discussion. I'm very curious to know. Zeg je? Ja? Dit is heel goed. Okay, I would like to know some more about the Jewish community in Berlin, about the emancipation, and about the play. So that is where we are going to discuss about. And then you, of course, are invited to ask questions as well. First of all, about the Jewish community in Berlin. You mentioned Moses and Felix Mendelssohn. Moses is, of course, the main character in the Jewish Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, of the end of the 18th century. How would you relate Felix to this Haskalah? Is this still an issue, the Jewish Enlightenment in Berlin, or not?
Yeah, for me this is a huge tragedy.
You need a microphone. Sorry.
I just pretend I'm telling my grandsons to do their homework and you'll hear me loud and clear. How's this? This is a huge...
Oh yeah, wait a moment, sorry.
Can I talk?
Yes. And certainly now, I think.
Okay, how about this? Is this good? Don't want those poor people outside to have to hear it. It's a huge tragedy because when Moses Mendelssohn dies, two of his children are, well, after he dies, two are Protestants, two are Catholics, and two are Jewish. And is this a metaphor for the stillborn failure of the Haskalah, or is this an accident? This is a question for the Moses Mendelssohn scholars, of which there's some amazing work being done. So he dies in 86. Felix is born well, I don't want to get the date wrong, but it's in the early 19th century, and Abraham decides that he doesn't want Mendelssohn's heritage. He quits his banking firm, which his brother Joseph continues to run. Joseph does not convert. And Abraham is the architect of Felix. I mean, he plans it all. I mean, he thinks he'll be a law professor, and then he turns out to be a great composer. But that's not really the point here. I mean, it is the point for music historians, but not for social historians. Why the Mendelssohns could not have been more like the Bears is something that gives me a tremendous amount of disquiet. Because the Bears stay Jewish. The Bears have a Wunderkind. The Bears participate in Reform Judaism, and Abraham and Felix, they'll have nothing to do with it. Now, music historians have huge debates about the content of, especially of Elijah and of his compositions. But let's not do all that now.
No, well, just to get a bigger picture, you're sketching a few upper-class Jews in Berlin, but there is a larger Jewish community there. Are they speaking Yiddish, or what is the influence of Eastern Europe? Of course, at the end of the 19th century, this influence is huge, but at the beginning of the 19th century, we don't know, and you know it. So perhaps.
Oh yeah, there's a wonderful article by a friend of mine. It's called "The Poor and the Orthodox" in 18th century Berlin, and I wish I could just download all the contents right now. There is a poor community, but it's not very large for two reasons. The first reason is that there's a myth that Jewish families protect the poor people in their family and that the family's like a clan. And Jacob Katz has shown very clearly that the phenomenal Jewish upward mobility through finance from the years 1600 to 1800 is accomplished by discarding your poor relatives. It's really very shocking and interesting research. So that's one reason why there are not so many poor Jews. But the main reason is because they're not let in. In order to get a legal permission to live in Berlin, you need to show a huge amount of money. Then you need to be taxed through the kazoo. And in Mendelssohn's case, for instance, they made him purchase these porcelain monkeys that they couldn't give away. So they made him take them and pay for them. So these people are paying a huge amount of money for the privilege of living there.
Okay. And in 1812, there is this edict of emancipation. Jews can get the Prussian nationality. And in retrospect, often is said that that's a sign of the tolerance of Prussia. And there, indeed, what you also said, there were not so many pogroms in the 19th century. So what has happened in the 20th century was more or less non-German, or to say this way.
You mean the violent anti-Semitism?
Violent anti-Semitism was France, of course, in France, and was not so much in Germany. Well, I think in retrospect now, German historians have seen that there was some more violence also in Germany, particularly local, and there was an anti-Semitism campaign in Berlin in the 1880s. But what I want to ask is, 1812 is, of course, a very important year for the change of Jewish identity, perhaps, in Berlin. But it was also a disappointment, exactly what you told us, because it made clear that they could become German, but they couldn't get a member of the tea clubs and couldn't become a full member of the Berlin society, upper class, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a lot of amazing research around the year 1812 of why this was coerced is too strong, but the wealthy Jews of Berlin, the Hertz bears, are meeting with Count von Hardenberg every week to plan the legislation. So they're sitting in a very well-to-do house. The Bears are giving huge amounts of money to the state. She's a major philanthropist, and she's, helping the wounded and, showing her patriotism. And the expectation is the Jews will reform themselves. They'll have a modern service. It won't be embarrassing. It's not like the Portuguese synagogue that I was at on All Day Sunday. These were, it's a long story, but the services were considered embarrassing because people were screaming and it wasn't very orderly and they didn't have a German sermon. So the quid pro quo that was expected was the Jews will change everything that they can change on the acculturated list, and then we will make them into citizens. But what does a citizen mean? Okay, you don't have the moral authority to be a high school teacher, for instance, and the university professorships were up for grabs. And what's actually worse than the Prussian situation is the situation in a lot of the towns like Frankfurt and Hamburg, where there had been Napoleonic legislation that was very pro-Jewish, that went further than the 1812 edict, that is completely retracted. So to be, and Heine is this, he's from Düsseldorf, and this is just horrible for him, that that somehow being pro-Jewish was considered French. So if you have to be a real German, it's like, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and you can't really be you can't be in favor of Napoleon in 1815. You can't. But all of the Jews, mainly in Germany, had been huge fans of Napoleon. That's a big crisis. And you could say that crisis of what is a real German is going on and on and on, is repeating itself in various incarnations. You can't be a leftist and a good German. You can't be this and a good German. So the edict is a big step forward. I think the Amsterdam story is very neglected here. Maybe I'm reading the wrong books, but in 1796, I think that either all of Holland or this is out of my field gets a parallel emancipation, so that Prussia is actually following Holland, and Rose, Rahel von Hagen's younger sister, Rose, who's married to Karl Asser, is in the thick of that. So an interesting parallel.
Yes, very interesting. Perhaps we should have another meeting about Amsterdam around 1800 and the end of the Jewish killer, which is the Jewish even social law in Amsterdam, which was very important to protect poor Jews. So when they became equal, they had equal rights, their protection also fell away. So,
exactly,
that's a very interesting issue in the theme. You talked about conversion. You didn't tell that, I think it is mainly conversion towards evangelical Lutheranism. How should we see this? Is this a form of syncretism, that they had their own Jewish habits and perhaps even practices, but went on Sunday to the church? Or perhaps did they do still Shabbat on Friday evening and went on Sunday to the church?
Yeah.
Is there any knowledge about it?
I love that. I mean, I worried for 18 years. I wake up every morning and worry about that. And I, in fact, when I finished my book, How Jews Became Germans, I was very distressed because I did not come down hard against the converts, and I did not endorse them either. And I say something like, my readers will have to decide. And I felt that was kind of an evasion of my responsibility as a historian, but ultimately I kept looking at it from different perspectives. So first of all, was it syncretism? I love that question, because if you talk about Shabbatai Tzvi or Jakob Frank, these were syncretists, and they were the secret Jews who were the
It's the use of the best of both worlds.
Yeah. I mean, they really believed, the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi and Jakob Frank, which were hundreds and thousands of people in the 17th and early 18th century, they actually believed that their Catholic converted Messiah was still Jewish, and that they were still Jewish. And they did have lots of secret rituals. In the Berlin case, no. It's much more like a total break, because they're not really involved in Judaism enough to bring anything with them. This would be Gershom Scholem's critique that there is no German-Jewish symbiosis, but there is. And I think this is a very apt critique of Reform Judaism too, is there is a hyper-Protestantization of Judaism that is the legacy of Reform Judaism, and that they're denying Judaism. Otherwise, why would they propose to have services on a Sunday? Move the Shabbat to Sunday. I mean, there are things that are so basic in Judaism that the Reformed Jews in Germany are willing to countenance. Now, one way to look at it is this was the Haskalah, carried into Protestantism. But ultimately, I see it as tragic. And when you look at a picture, for instance, to bring it back to family history, of the Mendelssohns have a reunion. I don't know why I know about this, but it's on the internet. It's a picture of, 150 Mendelssohns. How many Mendelssohns were Jewish in 1933? Almost none. Almost none. To me, that's a different tragedy than Nazism. It's kind of...
Why? The loss of identity? Or I mean, you can also say, well, if they converted and they're happy with it...
Well, that's a good question. Were they? Can you be happy when you? can you be happy when you cut yourself off from family members who are involved in not just a different religion, it's much deeper than that, a different clan, a different value system, a different emotional style. Maybe I'm being too tribal here, but it's hard for me to think that someone who's living on such a precarious amount of inner heritage that comes from such a strong community as Judaism could emotionally survive. And that's why I find the question of Ludwig Robert's creativity to be deeply fascinating. You know, if he had written, if somebody put him in a room and say, don't you write about a baboon, don't you write about a commoner in a duel, write about the Jews. Would he have written from his heart words that would have become more, I don't know, would he have survived posterity better?
So you didn't think he wrote about the Jews, or?
Well, that's what I was pestering poor Ezra. He took me out for coffee this morning. I think he wanted to relax a little bit from his search for the palm tree. And I kept asking him, tell me about those immediate reviews. You know, does everybody say, I mean, we know that there's a couple of instances where people shout out, you know, don't let the Jew be a playwright. It kind of goes very, very deeply into Wagner's hyper-critique of Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, which is certainly taken up by the Nazis and all German conservatives, really, by the 20th century, which is that Jews can't be creative. They're administrators of our culture, but they're not creators. And so I think Ludwig Robert is a very interesting case for that particular issue.
It is a Jewish play, or not? Didn't you read it as a Jewish play? Yeah, well, it is about outsiders, insiders, accepting the fate of being an outsider or not.
Yes, but
all issues which are very essential for many Jews in the 19th century, I think.
Yes, Berlin. But is he writing, like, as it were, a secret coda to other Jews in the audience? Or is he writing to make the Christian observers feel guilty for their poor treatment?
What's your answer?
Maybe both. I don't know. I don't know. There's an amazing article in 1912. I forgot the name of the author right now. Moritz Goldstein, perhaps. And it says, we need to withdraw from German culture. We're too prominent. This is not healthy for us. 1912. And I don't know what he would have thought of Ludwig Robert.
Could you tell us something more about the Paria of Michael Beer? Because these plays are related.
Yeah, I have I did a whole section on it.
So first, Michael Beer wrote the Paria, and a couple of years later, the Baviaan is not published, but it's written.
Well, a couple of things I thought were interesting. As far as I know, and I haven't read Deborah, I'm probably saying it wrong, two things that are interesting. It's set in India, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, sure. It's also very interesting aspect. So it could be a sort of translation. India as a translation of their own situation in Berlin.
Exactly. And it really made me think about the lines in De Paviaan where your character, you sure you don't want to put your cute little outfit on? That was very brave of you.
Thank you.
Is, you know, the professor it's kind of like the Blue Angel or something. The professor is. Anyway, I got off my track.
Michael Beer's the Paria.
The word Brahmin.
Yeah.
If you're in an island where there's been a shipwreck, why are you suddenly talking about Brahmins? It's like the two metaphorical environments are getting crossed in a very, very, very strange way. I didn't quite understand two things about this play that are incredibly interesting. Who knows that it's a satire of Michael Beer? I mean, I'm sure...
Ezra told us.
Ezra told us, right? The professor said it was right. and then there's the question also of why both of them are using this language. And I'll tell you what I thought of. I don't know if it's been translated into Dutch, but in 2020, an amazing journalist named Isabel Wilkerson wrote a book called, I have all the publishing information in my talk, it's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And in the Black Studies world, she created a huge furor because she argues in that book, this is to bring us into the history of colonialism, that the word race is younger by far than the word pariah. Mm-hmm. And that race can only become relevant once colonialism is activated. But we have many examples of a hierarchy that are pre-racial. And Wilkinson's argument is that race fits in to the caste metaphor. So my question that would be, I think, just fabulously interesting would be Ludwig Beer and Michael Beer, where did they get this metaphor from? And this is exactly the time when the German anthropologists in the 18th century, people like Humboldt and Kant, are all involved in a certain sense in the creation of the term race. Because, you know, if you don't get on boats, you don't know that.
And their discovery of India as well, because there was not so much knowledge of India until the end of the 18th century. So the concept of caste was more or less discovered by Europeans at the end of the 18th century.
Yes, and when Martin Luther King goes to India, he has these interviews where he tells the Indian people, you know, we are your untouchables. And there are societies like Japan who have an undercaste, an untouchable caste that's the same color. So this is a really prophetic, prescient, remarkable that they would use this language.
You really liked the piece, the play.
As I was watching it, I was thinking of all the levels that you could do this play. I could see this play in an anti-meat, vegetarian, outdoor struggle, you know, because it's all about, you know, does the animal not have noble feelings, you know, does the baboon not suffer? Then I also thought of it as a parable, a very prophetic parable about an intermarried family with the Nazis knocking on the door, and your character is the Nazi, and they're saying, what should we do? We can't live through this. And the, quote, Gentile human who's married to the baboon, he saved her, but she's also saved him. They're like, we have to commit suicide, but we can't protect our son. And then when the son returns to nature, I thought of that sort of getting on a boat going to Palestine. You know, like I'm re-Judaizing myself because I can't deal with this conflict anymore. And
the Pavian is accepting its fate as his own fate.
Well, that's the problem with the difference between Heine and Ludwig Robert, is that you saw that image of him with the pen skewering the aristocrat. Heine, even though he conforms with the conversion, I think his writing is much more incendiary and he's in Paris and he's accusing the Germans of all these, or the Prussians of all these dreadful things. And I would say he has more courage, although part of the issue here is what do we as historians know? If Ezra gets on a train and goes to Krakow and finds this play and reads all these letters that no one else has seen because von Hagen wanted to de-Judaize his wife, do we have the right to look at them, but it makes the people look sometimes very hypocritical when you know so much about what they wrote to someone that they trusted. So how do you live with that double identity? Like you say one thing to your sister, and then you produce a play and get a job with a completely different identity. How can you be creative when you have that many selves inside of you?
But if you compare it to Heine, I think Heine is much more lucid and cynical, perhaps, whereas Robert is much more metaphorical in his writings. At least I know only this play, but I think Heine would not have written this play. totally different style, or
Yes, no, I mean, I thought that the sort of vague metaphor really hit me as I was watching it, as I could read all those levels into it. And I think a very interesting question about this, how overt could you be on the German stage about Jewish emancipation, are the performances of Nathan der Weise, which was Lessing's play, who wasn't Jewish. And one of the interesting things is, who has more what do you need to have the courage to speak openly about discrimination in this? I still like Biedermeier.
Mm-hmm. You like the term? Yeah.
I'm still
okay.
in favor of Biedermeier, but maybe that makes me old here.
I discussed it with Ezra, and Ezra said, well, better not use it.
Well, yeah, because it's more often used to discuss furniture than maybe ideas. But I think this is a really, really interesting question. If you want to do anything that's in any way connected to Jews in a public manner, do you have to be a convert? Because that is the covering gesture that gives you the permission to enter into the public dialogue. And those with eyes to see could see, and those without the eyes could not see. So maybe this was part of a genius on his part to write it in this kind of parable.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. The microphone will be brought to you.
Good afternoon. Judah Engelsberg, related to Ezra.
Yeah, we know. Closely related.
I'd like to thank you. It's really very invigorating, and it's fast and deep, and often to us we miss it because of the electronics. But so I try to recall a number of things from this part of your presence. Yes.
He can't be fast and deep.
No. You are the. You came all the way from San Diego, and you.
See if I can recall a number of points. When you mentioned Frankfurt and the Frankists and Shabtai Tzvi, you very quickly said you referred to the Jews Catholic converted Messiah. And now I confess that it's been quite a long time since I was busy myself as an amateur in this period of Jewish history. But I thought that Shabtai Tzvi only became a Muslim. He took the turban, but he was not a Catholic. So it's just, perhaps you misspoke, it's a small thing. Another one is at Ezra's suggestion some years ago, I took it upon myself to read, now I forget his name, is it Goldschmidt or Goldschmann? Willing executioners.
Goldhagen is that English willing executioners.
Thank you, Professor. And somewhere, because I didn't, it was really, he's like hammering the point so that I really had enough, and I think I didn't get through more than a third of it. But somewhere in the first 100 pages, there are a number of paragraphs to which he devotes to, how shall I say it, in 19th century anti-Semitism in a very subtle way. The press, politicians, people from the pulpit, I think. So this is going on for a while. And if you don't know the entire literature, which is in the last few years become available, one is missing quite a lot. And there was one other point I thought, I must remember this, but now it's escaped me.
No problem. We have enough questions
so
about
if you could react to some of this,
Jewish
and sort of put it in the context,
yeah.
If not for everyone else, but certainly for me, I'd be very appreciative.
Yeah, the first question is totally important. So Shabtai Tzvi becomes a Muslim.
Becomes a Muslim. Yes.
1670, something like that.
Oh, you should use the mic.
Oh, yeah. That's good if I don't have the microphone in case I get the date wrong. Okay, Jakob Frank is another generation. He comes after Shabtai Tzvi. He's not in the Ottoman Empire. He's in Poland. There's a recent Polish novel by Olga Tokarczuk all about him. And he does become a Catholic. So he replicates the false Messiah syncretism in Catholicism. And just like in modern-day Turkey, there are the Donme that are the descendants of the Shabbatians. So in Poland, we have the Frankists who are the descendants of the followers of Jakob Frank. And I want to say one more thing about Haskalah. and false messiahs. Thanks to Gershom Scholem, a great Jewish scholar, we now know a lot more about the so-called failed messiahs. And one of the things that feminist historians of Judaism, you could say Maskilic historians or historians of the Haskalah, and historians of Reform Judaism, I talk about this a lot when I'm not in the classroom, when I'm not necessarily giving a talk, but it's really fascinating that they offered a kind of anti-Talmudic, anti-elitist, populist, female prophecy Judaism, which might have been much better than the Protestant version of the Maskilim of 19th century Germany for all sorts of reasons. That's number one. Number two, I dedicated my life to an anti-Goldhagian research program from the time I was an obnoxious little graduate student.
You are not the only one, by the way. There were many. But...
So my whole idea of writing about the salons was, let's find something good that the Jews did in Germany. Well, how far back do you have to go? And I just marched back until I found it. Because Goldhagen, he touched on a nerve that something huge and catastrophic, like Auschwitz, must have clear, decisive causes. Let's go to the library, let's find every anti-Semitic tract ever written, and let's just say that Hitler read them all. Boop, it's all finished. There's no World War I, you know, there's no defeat, there's no crisis of German democracy, you know, there's no charismatic figures in fascism. You know, think about the era we're living in now. Transpose yourself to 1933, and this is happening on the streets of Tel Aviv as we speak. This whole, you know, is history repeating itself, and are we sliding back into a fascist authoritarian era? And Goldhagen wrote something that was such catastrophically bad history that I'm glad you never finished the book, because that was always my ideal for Goldhagen. People will buy it. Then when they open it, they won't be able to read it, and it will become a dusty coffee table book. You know, it was a travesty, in my opinion, that book was not edited better and not. He's a political scientist. That's the kind of thing these people do. Sorry.
Right. No, thank you.
No, it's okay.
And while I'm sorry, while you were speaking,
one short question.
Yeah, the third point. It's part of the same paragraph.
Yeah, okay.
The third
You're the
point.
father of Ezra, so you are allowed
the third
to
point
ask many
was about when you're talking about Meyerbeer. I think his original name was Jacob Liebmann Beer.
Yeah.
Just to help your memory a bit. And parallel to that is you didn't mention Jacques Offenbach. I wonder why.
He's French. I only studied Germans.
He's French.
I don't know. You tell me more.
I have myself a follow-up question. Sorry, that I really want to ask, because you talk about criticism of the Torah of the what is it? The rabbins, rabbijnen. Rabbins, yeah. Of course, this traces back to Spinoza as well. And there is also a whole discussion about Spinoza. Was he an atheist or not? And this is a tradition which is, I think, evolving in the 19th century. Many Jews become atheists. But this is not yet in your period.
Well, actually, it is, because
yes?
Mendelssohn was afraid of becoming a Spinoza.
Yeah.
And which means that he will be excommunicated. So that's why he keeps kosher, and he does a lot of things that he's already maybe evolved past them in his own relationship to traditional Judaism, but he wants to preserve his official status as a loyal Jew. And I was thinking about this yesterday when I was you have amazing resources here. I must
come back.
Well, of course, moved to Amsterdam. You know. Yeah. But I mean, the exhibition of the 19th century in the Jewish Museum here. I think that's where I went to so many museums in one day that I was sort of drunk on Amsterdam history, and it showed Uriel da Costa lying down at the entrance to that synagogue and people stepping over him, and then he commits suicide. And the manuscript of his, I would call, maskilic critique of traditional Judaism is written in 1640 or something like that. And he gives his life for that cause. Or you could say he's kind of like your baboon who's killing himself because he can't bear it. Then Spinoza is, you could say, of a stronger constitution than Da Costa, and carries it through and suffers the consequences. And what I think was fascinating, this is sort of mixing into your business that's not really mine, which is that the synagogue, the Portuguese synagogue apparently still continues the ban on Spinoza, and Spinoza researchers and filmmakers cannot use that as a backdrop. Well, I completely understand not wanting your synagogue to be a backdrop for a movie. But the idea that Spinoza is the enemy of traditional Judaism it's right out of Jerusalem. You could do a transposition in which Spinoza is Tel Aviv, the rabbis are Jerusalem, and see this titanic battle of the right to recreate Judaism, to recreate it, and to somehow preserve, a kind of Hegelian Aufheben where you preserve and you transcend. And the fact that this is now an epic battle going on in the state of Israel is, those of us who teach history, we often think that some of these struggles are over. Oh yeah, the Haskalah won. Oh yeah, we defeated fascism. And then suddenly you realize you were a little facile.
Other questions? Yes, please. The microphone will be brought to you.
A bit further away, please. Being the brother of Rachel Varnhagen, who had this very important salon, what does that mean for his relationships and for his networking? Does it have no influence at all on gaining a good network for him, her brother? I just want some clarity about how that works. So, we know with Amalia Beer, with all her fame and her beautiful salon, that the picture of her son, which you showed, was removed from an exhibit, of an art exhibit, because he was Jewish and they didn't want that picture of that Jewish boy hanging there. So how much influence do these salon women have on the network of their family members? What kind of network can they create or can they not create for their specifically male family members?
Oh, that's a deep question. In the very beginning, in the first sentence of your question, were you talking about Bettina von Arnheim and Achim von Arnheim? No. Rahel Varnhagen and Ludwig Robert?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. So just in one quick sentence, say the question again.
So she has a very big network. Does that do nothing for him? Do these women who have these important networks, are they not able to do anything for their Jewish family members?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. Well, Barbara Hahn has made a name for herself in this scholarship by saying that Rahel Levin's first salon begins in the family. It's actually not what Hannah Arendt thought, which was this attic room where she's all alone. No. The family is entertaining Christians, especially nobles, on a regular basis. So Ludwig would have been a part of that when he was, say, a teenager. I think she's maybe 7 years older. But it all breaks up in 2006. She doesn't have a social world for him once the Napoleonic Wars start, because people leave Berlin, her salon closes down, her so-called noble friends often desert her. Between 2006 and her marriage in 2014, she's a desperate, unhappy person. And now that I get to know her sister in Amsterdam a little better, I really want to find out a little more about whether she wished she'd had that life. She's a desperate woman. And she's a social climber. That's why I don't do research on these people anymore. If it wasn't for Ezra's email, I would have nothing to do with these people. But here I am. Trip to Amsterdam, you know, wonderful, wonderful play. But it's a deep question. No, she can't offer any connections because they're too fragile. Then she gets this sort of, her husband is not necessarily an asset for her because he's always bragging about her and it drives people crazy. She, in a way, she achieves a lot more than he does with a lot less effort, which really is a kind of gender-bending question about the power of the salon, especially in posterity. And it's also a deep question about letters versus publication. He writes 25 plays. She writes, 25,000 letters that people don't burn, or she keeps copies of them. And now, literary historians, feminist literary historians, are claiming that that is the canon. Well, that's a big debate. I mean, what do you want in the canon? Do you want Ludwig Robert's letters in the canon, or do you want Der Pavian now that Ezra has resurrected it? You know, maybe it'll go in the YouTube canon. That's a joke. That's a deep question, Judith.
Other questions? Yeah, sure.
So, wouldn't you consider that all these various identities that are within one person isn't that often the source of their creativity?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that view. But what plagues me about it is the conflict. Like, apparently, is this the play, Ezra, that his family did not want him to make public? Is this the one?
It's another one.
It's another one. So that raises this question of, you have the multiple identities, you're going to choose one. The neutral playwright writing about discrimination. You're going to hide, or you're going to transpose your tears. And, you know, I wrote all over this because some of the lines in the play are so evocative that are not, you know, they're not the plea for vegetarianism, be nice to this baboon because it feels, even though it's not sentient or whatever, there's much more anguish and much more detail in there. You know, the baboon is complaining that he's not invited to court and to the literary societies. And I guess this is what makes it a sort of a comic satire is, well, that's preposterous. You know, why would you might not want to eat the baboon, but does that mean you want the baboon at your dinner table? So it seems that Robert is really stretching the metaphor to kind of a ridiculous level. And so, but yet why would the family not want it? I can't answer your question. I guess every creative person is different, but I cannot imagine, with all of these inner constrictions that Robert is obviously feeling, that he can't be openly Jewish in his writing. I can't think that was a healthy psychic inner atmosphere.
Trying to answer a question about converts is very complicated because, I mean, we know that converts, even though they were converted, were not accepted. And also, I mean, someone like Sorkin, who writes about, in the transformation of German Jewry, how people who have converted stick together and marry each other. So, I mean, if you read the diaries of Fanny Lewald, which I know you have, then you see how conflicted she is about wanting to convert or not to convert, and how the whole family, how it's the idea of the father, but actually she's not so keen on it. She said she would never believe, she couldn't confess in Jesus, but how it's convenient for her. But then she writes all these novels about Rachel Varnhagen, which are also about herself, and the conflict of identity. And I would just say all these, I would doubt very much that any of those converts are free of a conflicted identity.
No, that's right. I totally agree with that. You can't come out of such a deep and thick environment. You know, it would be very similar. A friend of mine runs a podcast called Off the Derech, which is about religious Jews. I don't know if you've watched Shtisel or Unorthodox, or, you know, there's kind of a wave of TV shows, Israeli TV shows about formerly Orthodox Jews. And I think it's a very similar issue. Can you really recreate yourself, you know, as a modern gay left-winger and leave all this behind? Or, the Jewish calendar is imprinted on you. Kosher is these things are imprinted in your psyche from your childhood. And are you really going to cut yourself off from your family? And so what we need in society today is the same thing that they needed, but they couldn't have, which was a kind of what Gershon Hundert calls and this relates to the Haskalah, harmonious modernization, in which you keep rituals, but you transform this. I think in the history of Judaism, because of Mordechai Kaplan's kind of anthropological view of Judaism, there's a much healthier relationship to tradition in Reconstructionist Judaism than there is in Reform Judaism. And I think it has to do with how does the individual preserve all the identities? Because you can have the mixture, but some of them you can be constantly pushing down because they're causing trouble for you.
But you're now comparing Mordechai Kaplan, whose ideas developed in the United States in a much different situation for Jews than the Reform rabbis who were trying to remain Jews while appropriating a lot of the culture around them, but giving it a twist and still remaining Jews. And actually, I just wanted to correct something you said. There weren't many Jews who wanted to change the Sabbath to Sunday. Many Jews didn't observe the Sabbath, and they weren't going to observe it if it would be on Sunday either. Only one radical rabbi, Samuel Holtheim, wanted to change it to Sunday, and all the others did want to keep it on Saturday, but they gave the Sabbath a different meaning. And of course, they had a lot of trouble with the Sabbath because everybody else was doing business on Sabbath, and they lost a lot of business if they didn't work on Sabbath. So the rabbis were engaged in a huge fight trying to keep their congregations in the synagogues when everybody else was going out to work and they were losing business. So I just published a book on Samuel Hirsch, whose son in the United States, in Chicago, did move the Sabbath to Sunday, but he was alone in that. So it wasn't something that everybody was doing. So we can have this conversation privately, because I think Reform Judaism is my thing.
This would be, I think this is very nice, a very interesting discussion as well. And for me, a last question could be, is it possible to accept multiple identities and be happy with it or not?
Well, that's the question of modernity. That's why these people are so fascinating to us, because this is a very, 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 very troubling. I guess one way to look at it is that we shouldn't place as much responsibility as I do on the individuals, because I'm involved in fights with them. I sort of talk to them a lot, and I'm obsessed with them. But maybe that's inappropriate, because maybe what we should be looking at are the structures that force them into a situation in which they feel they must have these multiple identities, and that our emphasis should more be on the pressures rather than the feeble attempts to escape the pressures.
Thank you very much. We've got a lot to think about. You have one last question?
Yes, very down-to-earth question, really, if you want.
Oh, we have...
About the 19th century Jews who converted. Going down to earth, were they buried Jewish or Christian?
Yeah, if you go to the big cemetery, the Weissensee Cemetery, it's my understanding that there's a special section for, if I'm not mistaken, I know it's for suicides, a special section, and I'm not entirely sure about answering your question. I know that the most important Saloniers who converted, Dorothea, Schlegel, Rahel, all their graves are in the Christian cemetery, the Protestant cemeteries of Berlin. And you can visit them. And this breaks my heart. If you go to Berlin today and you go to the so-called Mendelssohn grave, it's not really the Mendelssohn grave, because his grave was actually, I think, desecrated, but the DDR put up a kind of a grave, and it's filled with stones, and it's all alone as the only grave in this courtyard, where there were actually terrible roundups and horrible things that happened in that space. And then if I go to the Protestant cemetery and I see Rahel Varnhagen's grave there, or it's painful for me. because it evokes this binary that we're trying to get away from. You're either Jewish or you're Protestant. It's a deep question. You could write a whole book. And a great research tool is this bizarre little internet game called Find a Grave. It's not a game, but I see dissertations piling up on this great topic.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Yeah.